doesn't go for those two.
All right, welcome back. We're only running slightly behind. The next panel bumps up against lunch, so that'll be just fine. I'd like to introduce David Hahn, a colleague of mine here at Pepperdine, and he will be the moderator for the next panel on law, ethics, and theology. I've been really excited. You know, you have all the anticipation building up to the conference, and the first panel was just tremendous, so I'm really looking forward to this one and the remainder of the day. So, David.
So thanks so much, Derek. My name is David Hahn. I'm an associate professor of law here at Pepperdine. It's really my great honor to moderate this panel celebrating the work of Bob Cochran. And I have to say, from the moment that I arrived at Pepperdine nearly 6 years ago, Bob has been many things to me. He's been a warm and welcoming colleague. He's been a trusted friend and confidant. He's been a consistent source of scholarly insight and wise counsel. But really, much more than that, Bob represents so much of what I aspire to be as a scholar, as a teacher, as a mentor, and as a colleague. And I don't think I can put it in better words than what Dean Karen said in the program, so I'm just going to repeat some of those words. In truth, Bob acts as coach for all of us at Pepperdine Law, students, staff, faculty, and deans alike. We are all better scholars, teachers, workers, servants, and people because of his presence among us. So on that note, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce the four wonderful speakers that we have for this morning's panel. They're all going to be discussing Bob's work with respect to law, ethics, and theology. So joining us today are Roger Alford, who is currently serving as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General with the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. He's currently on leave as a Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School. David Caudill, who is the Arthur M. Goldberg Family Chair and a Professor of Law at the Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law. Amy Uelmen, who is a lecturer at Georgetown Law School. And David VanDrunen, who is the Robert B. Strimple Professor of Systematic Theology and Christian Ethics at Westminster Seminary, California. So I'm going to turn things over to our speakers, and once we've had a chance to hear from all of them, we'll then open up for questions. So, Professor Alford.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I was one of the few people that was not upset about the government shutdown because as an accepted employee, I was only allowed to work on critical matters. And so basically for a few hours a day, I would work on the critical matters, and all the other time, I was like, what can I say about Bob Cochran? So I was basically spending hours, far more time than I should have, thinking about my remarks, and I got to call, and as a result of that, I got to call every single former director of the institutes that I'm going to talk about today. And so it was great fun. I'm required to make this disclaimer. It's not really necessary, but I'll do it. The views that I express today are my own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Justice or its staff, which is another way of saying that whatever are the official views of Bob Cochran by the U.S. government, I don't know what they are. I speak in my personal capacity. So I'm sure the government has official views about Bob. I speak in my personal capacity. So we typically think about professors in a variety of different ways. If you think about what the impact is of a professor, in many respects, for the really successful scholars, we focus on their ideas and on sort of the legacy of their thought, and that's what we are going to do most of today. But I am unique among the panelists in that I was here at Pepperdine for 11 years. So I want to give an institutional perspective about Bob's legacy and talk about the impact that he had at Pepperdine over the course of the years since he started here in 1983. It goes without saying, and I could have a whole separate 12 minutes on this, about Bob as a mentor and a coach and a person who really does bring up the faculty and mentor the students. He certainly did that for me. He did that for my wife as well. My wife was blown away that when you were recruiting me, she couldn't come with me, so a whole separate weekend was spent recruiting her, and Bob was in charge of that recruitment effort as well. So Bob really was a mentor to many, many faculty members, including myself. And one way to think about that is, Bob greatly revered Tom Schaefer at UVA. You could easily make the argument that just as Tom Schaefer had a lasting impact on Bob Cochran when he was a law student in Virginia, so too has Bob Cochran had a lasting impact on students and colleagues who have been inspired by his life and by his legacy. So there's many things that one could say about Bob Cochran, but I want to focus on Pepperdine and what the impact that he made at Pepperdine. And I think it's safe to say that Bob Cochran has been one of the most significant faculty members in the history of Pepperdine Law School. If you read the 40-year history of Pepperdine Law School that Jim Gash and Jenny Ruff put together, it's filled with discussions about Ron Phillips and the various deans that were here. But if you go beyond the deans and the associate deans and look at who is referenced throughout the latter decades of Pepperdine, Bob Cochran is frequently mentioned in this book. And so I think it's safe to say that Bob has been a real institution builder. He's been on 3 dean search committees, 2 provost committees, and 1 presidential search committee. And that's a testament of the trust that the faculty has in him. And he's done all of this without ever having served as a dean or an associate dean. He's never been an associate dean, he's never been a dean. He's just done this out of the sort of energy that just bubbles up within him. And I think the takeaway I want to have for my remarks is that perhaps more than anyone else in the history of Pepperdine Law School, Bob has done more institute centers and clinics than I think that are permanent fixtures of the law school than I think perhaps anyone else. You can look at other great entrepreneurs on the law school faculty, Randy Lowry for the Strauss Institute, Janet Kerr for the Center for Entrepreneurship, and the Palmer Center, Colleen Graffey for the London program. But no one has had multiple institutes and clinics established under his term. And so I encourage you to not overlook these last 3 pages of this brochure and think upon the idea of multiple agencies being founded by one faculty member. So I think, if you want to put it in a nutshell, he is the law school's great serial entrepreneur who has established one successful startup after another and then let directors run them. And that's the sort of nutshell of what I want to focus on today. So let me give you, I won't talk about all of the ones that are in this brochure, I just want to focus on 3 of them. Pause and accept that I'm only going to focus on 3 of the things that he's focused on, not the Judicial Clerkship Institute, not the JD MDiv program, not the other things that he's done. I'm just going to focus on just three of the institutes that he's helped establish. The first is the Legal Aid Clinic at the Union Rescue Mission. I spoke with the 2 directors of the Union Rescue Mission. There's only been 2, and I spoke with both of them, Jill Cutrulli, is that how you pronounce it? Jill Cutrulli, and Brittany String Longfellow. And both of them were influenced greatly by Bob's vision for what it meant to be a Christian who cared for the poor as a lawyer. And so the Union Rescue Mission Legal Aid Clinic started in 1998 as an idea in a class that Bob was teaching called Christ, the Law, and the Legal Profession. Students in the class expressed interest in integrating their faith with their skills as a lawyer, and as a result of that, the Legal Aid Clinic was born. It started as a pilot project by students and expanded to include faculty, lawyers, and law students. In the early years, I love talking to Jill, because she said in the early years, we basically would take 2 or 3 faculty members and then about 5 students, and we would go to the Union Rescue Mission, and we really had no clue. And she emphasized the faculty and the students really had no clue. Like they were really just struggling to try to figure out what they were supposed to be doing. It goes without saying that legal problems for the poor are far more influential in their lives than for most people, because there's a downward spiral that happens when you can't pay the rent, or you can't get the landlord to repair their apartment, or you have a ticket and you don't pay it. There's a whole range of different issues that come up, and there's a downward spiral that happens if there's not legal aid for the poor. And so that's really what the Legal Aid Clinic was trying to focus on. And what began as a small venture with a few professors morphed into a clinical program in which there are dozens of students involved in it every year, and now there's alumni after alumni that have been impacted by the Union Rescue Mission. In the early years, the work was fluid and the organization was haphazard, but eventually the volunteering became more organized, and soon there was an externship program with clinical classes. And Jill recalled the many, many early years where she would be calling Bob crying, like, I don't know how we're going to do this. And in her words, Bob would walk her away from the cliff to basically encourage her to keep going, and that you can do it. Brittany Stringfellow Ote began the directorship of the center in 2003, and from 2003 forward, really, the Union Rescue Mission became institutionalized within Pepperdine. It was no longer simply a legal outreach program, it actually became a really formalized program within Pepperdine. And the way Jill put it, she said, it really started as a notebook that I would keep in my briefcase, and then eventually it grew into a filing cabinet. And then it grew from a filing cabinet into an office with a borrowed desk, and then it grew into a clinic. And that's sort of where it is now. I asked both Jill and Brittany how Union Rescue has changed not just Pepperdine, but also the broader Los Angeles legal community. Both of them recalled that in the early years, everyone was shocked that a school like Pepperdine would be doing aid for the poor. And at the time, the mantra that they received often was, well, conservatives don't do legal aid, was the common refrain. And Jill said, in the early years, Pepperdine students were viewed as novelties in the legal aid world, but over the years, Pepperdine has earned a reputation through URM, linking arm in arm with people of all different types. And so, in terms of the legacy of the Union Rescue Mission, it's changed the reputation of Pepperdine in the Los Angeles legal community for caring about the poor. It's also changed the legacy of students. Brittany starts every single clinic at Pepperdine saying, this clinic should bother you for the rest of your life. Because for the rest of your life, you're going to be thinking about legal aid for the poor in different ways. So that's Union Rescue Mission. The New Bar Center for Law, Religion, and Ethics began in the early 2000s. I was involved in this as well, so I have also firsthand knowledge of this development. And it basically began from various grants that were internal grants, Voyager grants, as well as outside grants, Lilly money and things like that. And essentially Bob and I and Lee Boyd and a bunch of other people, Ken Starr, said, there's all this money that's available from these grants. What should we do on law, religion, and ethics? And Bob and I basically said, let's create an institute, because we're all doing all this stuff anyway. Let's create an institute to sort of give shape or inform around what we're doing. But of course, no one wanted to be the director of the institute, right? Because we want to write. We want to write. And so the idea was to basically find ways that we could cobble together funds and hire someone that could do part-time this and then part-time something else, and then somehow we would get it moving forward. So I have a quote from Bob to emails to Ken Starr encouraging him all of these ideas. But basically, and that's how we hired Melanie Howard, the first director. And so basically from the mid-2000s, New Bar Institute is focused, as we all know, on the intersection between law, religion, and ethics, and all of the conferences that are in the back of this, I think, give shape and ideas to the kinds of things that he was focused on. So the New Bar Institute is probably the one that all of you are most familiar with, and that's really the idea of really focusing on the intersection between law, religion, and ethics, and really thinking about what it means to do Christian faith from the legal perspective. And I think really what the New Bar Institute has tried to do is align the law with Christian principles and demonstrate love through the law. I think that's really what was interesting. How did this get started? Well, I like the way Melanie put it when we spoke on the phone last week. Bob was respected and trusted by everyone on the faculty, and he was careful in how he managed that trust. So as a result, he could take risks because of the trust that he had earned by the other faculty. And I learned this very, very early. All of the ideas that I had, I knew if I just sold Bob on them, that Bob would then sell them to the rest of the faculty. So I was a tenure track faculty that had all these entrepreneurial ideas, and I would always launder them through Bob. and then Bob would basically jump on them and then say, oh, well, that's a great idea, Bob wants to do it. So closely related to the Newt Barr Center, which really is focusing on the sort of intellectual ideas about the relationship between law, faith, and ethics, is the Global Justice Program. And really, you could think about the Global Justice Program as the international equivalent of the Legal Aid Clinic, right? It's really the sort of international corollary to care and concern for the poor. And so it's sort of, the idea of global justice, at least at Pepperdine, is to find ways for students to have opportunities to promote the rule of law, engage in national social justice work around the world. And the timing was perfect, right? The timing was perfect. Because at the exact same time that there was this massive movement within the evangelical community through the likes of Gary Haugen and Bob Goff, when there was this huge student outpouring of interest in thinking about global justice and the rule of law in a different way, this was exactly the time when Bob was proposing to do a global justice program at Pepperdine. And the way Jay Milbrandt put it, another director of the global justice program, so many students were interested in doing IJM work that the demand far exceeded the supply of available student internship opportunities. So we just built a program within the law school that mirrored what IJM was already doing, essentially. It was the idea that what is going out there and being done by international Christian NGOs could be done inside a law school as well. So that, I think, is one way to think about what the Global Justice Program has done. How has the Global Justice Program changed Pepperdine? Well, I think you could say that the way other people have said it is it's essentially in the DNA of Pepperdine now. You walk up the hallways of Pepperdine and you can sort of feel the concern for the poor and the dispossessed. And as a result, you get higher quality students with a real heart for the rule of law, and it really changes the culture of the school as a result of that. There's a great story. Gary Haugen came to Pepperdine in the late 1990s, and 12 people showed up. And then, 15 years later, Gary Haugen is the keynote speaker at the annual dinner, and hundreds of people are there, and Haugen is praising Pepperdine as the leader for global justice of all law schools in the country. That's a 15-year spread, and that's a pretty amazing thing to be able to say. So in conclusion, I could say much more, and I will in my written remarks, but one way to think about Bob's legacy institutionally is that his scholarship on moral empowerment, sensitivity, and judgment has been manifest in the institutes that he has helped create. His institutional work, I'm talking about his book on, with Tom Schaefer on clients and moral responsibility. He says that we should be empowering clients in a certain way, and I'm going to suggest that he's also empowering students in the same way through these institutes and through these clinics. And that is to assume control early in their legal careers, to be sensitive to the consequences of their actions on others, to make good moral judgments, and to create incentives and opportunities to follow their conscience. That really is sort of the moral discourse that he has helped empower through these various institutes. Another way to reflect on his institutional impact is to think about it this way. Bob loved the theory behind the institutions as much as the institutions themselves. So Jay Milbrandt tells this great story about Bob rushing down the hallway to have Bob share this great article, by Dallas Willard about faith and how to live the law of love. And Jay was sort of like, whatever, it doesn't do it for me. The theory behind it doesn't really do it for me. But it did it for Bob. Bob was really, really interested in the theory of how to manifest love and then to give and to sort of embody that through these various institutes. And so that's another way to, I think about it. How has also the Institute impacted other law schools? Well, I think there's a whole variety of ways. In terms of Union Rescue Mission, what started out as a legal aid clinic also became a mental health clinic with the psychology department at Pepperdine. What started out as a legal aid clinic by Pepperdine was then replicated by UCLA at the Union Rescue Mission. And so there's a number of sort of Christian-oriented legal aid clinics and other legal aid clinics that were manifested as a result of that. The Global Justice Program is now being replicated at other Christian-related law schools as well, including Regent Law School and Baylor Law School. And then beyond that, of course, the Los Angeles court system now has a homeless court that started in the Union Rescue Mission. And as we all know from Jim Gash's work, the Uganda has literally changed their laws, their criminal laws, as a result of the work that the Global Justice Program has done. So let me conclude it in this way. In terms of the relationship between institution building and scholarship. The average shelf life of a law review article is a few years, perhaps a decade, right? One could say. But through the institutes, clinics, and other initiatives that Bob Cochran has helped create, his ideas and his visions are going to inspire students and faculty for decades. And long after he's gone, we're going to be talking about the rule of law and care for the poor and doing justice through these institutes. Thank you.
That was great. I have to talk fast because I thought I had 15 minutes. David Hunt said you have 12. I said, no, I think I have 15. He says, yeah, 12. And I said, well, I was going to say about 3 minutes of nice things about Bob. He said, good, cut that. What you were saying. So let me thank Derek for including me in this special event and for including me in this very impressive lineup. I met Bob in 1995, and for 24 years we've stayed in touch, seeing each other every 4 or 5 years at conferences. I've contributed chapters to 3 of his books. We are the same age. We share the joy of working on airplanes. We know that in this busy 21st century life of cluttered lives and cell phones and email, we love to get on an airplane and sit in a seat and focus and get stuff done. So in your honor, I wrote this on the airplane on the way here. We have something else in common, and that is what I'm going to write about in my essay for the Law Review's festschrift. Namely, a fascination with Abraham Kuyper and the Neo-Calvinist movement within the Dutch Reformed Church. We have both found inspiration and compelling insights for our legal scholarship in that European evangelical movement. European meaning they smoke and drink, otherwise the same. And we have something else in common. Unlike most of those who study Kuyper, or read Doyeweerd, or seek degrees at the Free University of Amsterdam, or the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, we are not Dutch. We are not Dutch immigrants. We are not children of Dutch immigrants. We were not born in Holland, Michigan. We did not attend Calvin College or York College. We grew up instead in the American evangelical tradition, and we were each raised by a Southern Baptist father. And we both had that experience of an evangelical faith that was, we might say, overly spiritualistic and otherworldly, to an extent that the only thing really worth doing is full-time Christian work, because Christ is returning soon, and we should all be sharing the gospel as much as possible, either as foreign missionaries or as campus missionaries. Now, nowadays, we talked about it before, evangelicals are much more interested in and engaged in political and socio-cultural affairs, but 45 years ago, it seemed like we were only interested in saving souls when we were not reading the Bible or praying. So I think you can see how interesting it was. Let me go to a slide here. How interesting it was as college students to say, read Francis Schaeffer, who seems so scholarly with his interest in art and philosophy and cultural history. And you can see how Kuyper's famous notion that we should claim every square inch of the creation for Christ, how that could inspire you to get involved in law or medicine or politics. Indeed, to get involved in anything, whether car repair work or the grocery business, because any job can be an office, a calling in the kingdom. In my brief remarks, I want to talk about Neo-Calvinism and highlight a few ideas or conceptions associated with Kuyper. Then I will identify those ideas in Bob's work. Let me start with Dutch history, which roughly corresponds with the Reformation in Europe and involved a revolt against Spain and against Catholics. Here is one of several paintings I saw last weekend at the Met of a church in Delft that was whitewashed, emptied of all gold icons and stained glass. The church actually became a place where business is done during the week. And maybe the dog urinating would be a metaphor for the disrespect of churches if it was painted by a Catholic. But it was painted by a Protestant, and it is instead a metaphor for the individualism that Mike McConnell talked about, the Calvinist view that no church or priest or sacrament will save you. It's only the grace of God and your isolated relationship with Him. Also, the business meetings in the church during the week align with every believer having a calling that is as sacred as any other. Apart from Calvin's individualism and the sense of calling, John Whitty points out that this reformational reduction of the Catholic Church was a break with clerical authority, which soon vested new powers in civil authorities and in civil laws, and it's good for Christians to be involved in civil government. The Neo-Calvinist movement is usually attributed to Groen van Prinsterer, who was involved in politics and in organizing Christian schools and Christian labor unions. His anti-revolutionary party, which was critical of the anti-religious humanism in the French Revolution. That anti-revolutionary party is where Kuyper gets his start in politics, and that takes him all the way to becoming prime minister. And it is Kuyper's follower, Herman Dooyeweerd, who tried to develop a radically Christian philosophy on the basis of Kuyper's views. In this story, Neo-Calvinism is only a minor movement. As Dooyeweerd says, merely one particular segment of Dutch Calvinism. It's not all of Dutch Calvinism, it's one particular segment of Dutch Calvinism, and not even part of Reformed thought in other countries, because it's a narrowly Dutch analytical framework passed on from Groen to Kuyper to Dooyeweerd. On the other hand, Al Walters says, Neo-Calvinism is not just some idiosyncratic sectarian Dutch movement, because it is part of, and it is consistent with, the Christian tradition from the Church Fathers to Augustine to Calvin, and only then to Groen and Kuyper and Dooyeweerd. So it's a big deal. Now, if I can limit my remarks to Kuyper, to three of Kuyper's theological conceptions, namely sphere sovereignty, antithesis, and common grace, I can show you that Bob Cochran, in three of his published essays, explored the relevance of those conceptions for law. Scholars in the Neo-Calvinist movement are known for undertaking two tasks. First, there is an effort to level the playing field in social and political discourse by showing that fundamental commitments are inevitable, and therefore Christian views are no different from non-religious arguments in that respect. Secondly, there's always the question in Kuyper's claim of every square inch for the kingdom. What is the Christian view of art, of science, of mathematics, of the environment, of education, of political theory, of labor issues, and so on? Bob makes both of these moves in his legal scholarship and draws on Neo-Calvinism to do so. Sphere sovereignty is the idea that there are spheres such as the state, but the state is not sovereign over the family or the church, each of which is independent and sovereign over the activities in its own sphere. This was also an argument for Christian institutions like non-state schools, labor unions, and hospitals. But this is not only a pluralism of social structures, it's also a pluralism of worldviews, since Kuyper knew that there were non-Christian belief systems that would have sovereignty in their spheres. In his chapter on tort law in the 2001 collection, Christian Perspectives, that Angela talked about, that she edited with Mike McConnell and Bob, Bob there challenged the notion that tort law is or should be primarily individualistic. And Bob did that by focusing on these intermediate communities like families and churches, which deserve to be protected. Bob explained the sphere sovereignty in Kuyper's terms. He explained sphere sovereignty in Kuyper's terms, and then, in order to show that Neo-Calvinism was not some strange, weird movement, he analogized it with Catholic notions of subsidiarity. And then Bob argued for the importance of intermediate communities as constitutive of the self, in Sandel's communitarian terms, as a moral compass in Alistair MacIntyre's terms, and as a benefit to the culture at large. Tort law's individualism, that is, for example, no obligation to help anybody. That's reflected in our willingness to abandon parental immunities and charitable immunities, and in our imposition of strict liability on parents for their kids' torts. Intermediate communities should, Bob says, lose sometimes, but we should not let the state have all the power in ways that weaken these communities. There should be a balance between the discretion allowed to communities, but also holding them responsible. And Bob based that argument on Kuyper's sphere sovereignty and on Pope Leo's notion of subsidiarity. Bob tried to find a middle course between extremes of individualism and collectivism. Moving along. Antithesis. Kuyper's view of antithesis was an effort to distinguish Christian thought from other belief systems. Christians might interpret reality differently, and they should not have to sacrifice that perspective in public life. The pluralism I mentioned as an implication of sphere sovereignty here gives rise to notions of religious freedom and religious toleration. Kuyper would, of course, view atheistic humanists as religious believers. They just happen to have the religion of the Enlightenment. But he would also reject theocracy, and he would reject any efforts to force anyone to follow Christ or any other religion. In Bob's introduction to a symposium of Christian views on law and legal scholarship, a symposium on law and legal scholarship, which was amazingly, miraculously, published in the AALS Journal of Legal Education. It's a little bit like Yale Press doing your book. Anyway, Bob reflected on the notion of worldviews, of how we see the world, and he impliedly presented the antithesis between faith in God on the one hand, and on the other hand, faith in individualism, in Enlightenment rationalism, in human autonomy, in scientific naturalism. There's some overlap, some common ground to work with between those views, but there's also some clear distinctions. Bob points out that Christians might agree with Marxists on the need for economic fairness, or with feminists on the dangers of pornography, but there are also serious disagreements with secular humanists, and even disagreements within the Christian community on matters such as abortion or gay marriage. In any event, Bob concluded we should engage in legal scholarship just as Calvin engaged in Genevan politics, as Groen van Prinsterer engaged in Dutch politics, and as Kuyper became prime minister. We have something to offer as Christians. That is engaged pluralism. In contrast to antithesis, the theological doctrine of common grace stresses our shared humanity and our public responsibility. Good things can arise from human beings who know God, but good things can arise from people who do not know God. God extends his grace to the world, and we see people who are not Christians serving others. We see advances in science by scientists who are not Christians. We see great art painted by people who are not Christians, and we even see justice in settings outside the Christian community. Bob engaged the neo-Calvinist doctrine of common grace in his St. Thomas Law Journal article on Catholic and evangelical Supreme Court justices. Notwithstanding the critique of human reason that I talked about in antithesis, in Calvinism, there is also in Calvinism common grace. The ability to discern right from wrong that is given to all people, which made Kuyper think that we can find peace and justice together. Bob argued that natural law, the focus of many Catholic thinkers, is a manifestation of common grace, of something that maybe all people can agree on and get behind. And it can be a higher law, it can be a corrective to the status quo, it can be a corrective to existing law. In the end, however, there is no common sense to which we can all appeal. There is no neutrality, no value-free rationalism that can rise above religious faith. There is only, from Kuyper's perspective, a debate between religious people, between believers, some of whom believe in God, and some of whom believe in something else. But it's a debate, a competition, and here the notion of pluralism returns. Because everyone's pushing an agenda that each thinks is good for everyone, which is the very nature of a good policy debate. As Bob explains, it is not that we allow Christians to bring their biases into the public arena. It is that religious biases are inevitable on the part of everybody in that arena. So in conclusion, we should mention that not all of Kuyper's views are attractive nowadays, particularly with respect to race and gender. but there is still much to appreciate. Bob and I have both found some inspiration in Kuyper's views, and Bob has even pushed neo-Calvinism further along by developing and applying its perspective in new legal settings. Thanks.
So I am just so thrilled to be together in this setting and also learning so much from our conversations with each other, but most of all to celebrate a person. And so this is going to be a little bit more personal. And so in some ways it's a companion to David's, but it's called Bob Cochran, Man of the Beatitudes. I could think of no better way to honor Bob Cochran than to take as a touchstone for my reflection a passage from Scripture, and one that he himself has referred to in his own scholarship, the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are, to take a phrase from Hamilton, the world turned upside down. Much of the world of lawyers would be, as Bob himself has noted, a place where the rich, the strong, and the warlike win, and winners take all. Instead, Bob's work, and by this I mean the personal example of what it means to be a follower of Christ that shines through his collegial relationships and his scholarship, has been all about the courage to turn that world upside down. So in this brief reflection, I would like to draw not only on Bob's scholarship, this is an excerpt and there's a longer essay, but also on seeing Bob in action as our paths have crossed over the years, especially in our parallel work at the intersection of religion, law, and professional life. And I hope to highlight his example not only to do good, but to be good in a world and in a profession where this seems increasingly difficult. Blessed are the poor in spirit. As Simon Caudill writes, it's really only the poor in spirit who can actually have anything, because they are the ones who know how to receive. For them, everything is a gift. What we celebrate today is Bob's capacity to open himself to all of God's gifts, his open, creative, trusting, welcoming spirit that also helps to generate the most beautiful forms of collaboration. And I have experienced this in countless ways. In the early 2000s, Bob and I, together with Russ Pierce, launched parallel projects on religion, law, and ethics. At Fordham, the Institute on Religion, Law, and Lawyers' Work, and here at Pepperdine, as we've heard so recounted so beautifully, Bob consolidated his amazing work and that of his colleagues in the New Bar Institute on religion, law, religion, and ethics. And then in the years that followed, a number of other centers and projects blossomed as religiously affiliated law schools aimed to consolidate their resources and interdisciplinary work. So how did Bob stand in this garden of flowers that were beginning to bloom? The temptation in these moments is often to try and gather as many resources for one's own work or to contemplate the beauty of one's own particular flower. Instead, I always sensed in Bob a person who rejoiced in the beauty of all the flowers, to celebrate not only how God was working through his own gifts and the focus of his institution, but also the positive efforts of others. This was always evident in the exquisite hospitality that we have experienced in the conferences here at Pepperdine over the years. And his contributions to Fordham's Religion and Poverty Law Conference in 2003 was especially meaningful for me. His open-hearted, open-minded appreciation, I see, is also incredibly evident in his ecumenical spirit and profound capacity to appreciate what the various Christian denominations have to offer for reflection on the law. Blessed are you, Bob, not only because your non-ego-driven approach to academic life has granted you tremendous freedom and joy, but also because you have helped many of us personally and institutionally through conferences, gatherings, symposia, to experience the kingdom of God among us. Blessed are those who mourn. In the past few years, Pope Francis has repeatedly encouraged us to pray for the grace of tears, to find again the capacity to weep when we see the human impact of violence, greed, and indifference. I would like to ask, who here has been at a conference or workshop or other gathering where Bob has recounted a story or shared an encounter with someone or a situation that has moved him even to tears. Personally, I have been deeply touched by Bob's capacity for personal, sincere, emotional engagement that evinces not only his empathy for people who have been touched by tragedy, difficulty, or some other powerful experience, but his capacity to share with simplicity and sincerity this dimension in legal academic environments. It is a rare gift. I think we can all agree with that. Blessed are you, Bob, for helping to humanize legal education and academic discussion by opening your heart to suffering in our world and sharing even visibly how this has touched you. I have no doubt that this capacity has been an endless source of comfort for many who suffer, and I would venture to guess this has in turn helped to generate a sense of comfort in their own life. Yours is the kingdom. Blessed are the meek. It's not easy to speak of meekness in our world today. For some, the world connotes a weak and even enabling passivity in the face of manifest injustice or wrong. One commentator wisely suggested, to see what meekness is, you must look at not at meekness, but at Christ. What are the Christ-like attitudes and attributes in Bob that make this beatitude visible? Linked with his capacity to mourn is his capacity to welcome vulnerability as a gift. For example, in one article critiquing an overemphasis on autonomy and client counseling, he explains that this accent suggests that independence is always good and dependence is always bad. But dependence on neighbors, on friends, on spouses, on parents, on children, increasingly at my age, can be among the greatest joys of human life. That's just one of the many jewels in the scholarship. For me, one of the best examples of Bob's nuanced appreciation of this beatitude is his profound analysis of honor as a value in the legal profession, read in the light of Joseph Conrad's Nostromo. What is Bob's beatitudinal insight for the legal profession? He muses, Conrad is best at exposing moral pretensions. We must be stripped of our pretensions so that we can build our moral lives on solid ground. Blessed are you, Bob. Your own capacity to model Christ-like meekness, to be stripped of pretensions, is a candle in the darkness of our world that shines on a path toward gaining some cultural ground even now. Blessed are the merciful. And this connects with a word that's needed so now, mercy. Empathy, compassion, understanding in the encounter with anyone's experience of suffering, fragility, and limits. And it also embraces situations that call for hard decisions where there seems to be no good option. It evokes what seems to be the common and pervasive desire at the heart of our culture today to live and move in a judgment-free zone. Bob's heart of mercy is in full display in his analysis of the character Nostromo. Here is a judgment-free zone if I ever saw one. He writes, I suspect that most of us have sensed within ourselves the desire for the approval of others. Nostromo seems real because he merely carries to an extreme what we see in ourselves. This level in empathy in turn leads to a profound effort to understand what might be at the root of another person's moral downfall. Maybe, just maybe, it is not because that person is inherently bad and so to be cast aside in condemnation. Perhaps, as Bob surmises, it was because this character had no other source of identity. He was an orphan, without a family, without a country, without a religious congregation. So where does mercy lead? It leads back to community. We've heard so much about this morning. Bob writes, if I am right that one of the reasons for Nostromo's obsession with honor and his moral downfall is his unconnectedness, one of the lessons of Nostromo may be that within communities, it is within communities, with families, religious congregations, and friendships, that we can find some moral foundations. Blessed are you, Bob, for all the ways in which you have brought your merciful heart to your relationships, your work, and your scholarship. Mercy shall be yours because you have helped to sow these seeds of mercy in the terrain of our reflections on professional life. Now I'm going to put together those, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and blessed are the pure of heart. As John Miller writes, the reference to hunger and thirst prompts a look at our heart's desire. What hungers and desires operate within us? Which of them commands our utmost loyalty? And this brings me to what I consider to be one of the most important contributions of Bob's scholarship, his capacity to offer to the field of legal ethics a clear-eyed, critical perspective on the place and limits of the rules, on the foundations for ethics, and to offer with Tom Schaefer an extraordinarily creative contribution to the scholarly discourse on models for lawyers in counseling clients. And this ties directly in with David's outline of the foundation for those scholarships. I think we cannot meditate enough on the work Bob has done to sustain a more complete sense of justice and righteousness that emerges from a contextual analysis of the client's situation. And this is especially evident in his 2000 analysis of asserting technical defenses, including the question of what exactly is technical, and how that can be shot through with moral complexity. In my view, it is Bob's purity of heart that enables him to see, together with Tom Schaefer, the possibilities that friendship has to offer for a model of client counseling. As those immersed in this debate know, these arguments are made in the midst of a thicket of difficult questions about client autonomy, manipulation of power, and the potential messiness of personal and relational entanglements. Bob and Tom both appreciate that. The moral life has risks, they write. There are risks to moral discourse, but we think those risks are worth it. And here too, we can place their model against the backdrop of a hunger and thirst for righteousness that critically assesses our moral foundations for legal ethics and the resources that help to strengthen that foundation. And again, here all roads lead to community. Blessed are you, Bob, for all the ways in which your own hunger and thirst for a deeper vision has helped to fill our discourse about legal ethics with a rich and beautiful vision for how to humanize our relationships in this field. And blessed are we for how the clarity of your vision has helped many to see the alternative resources, gifts of God for profound renewal. We could do an entire day on Blessed are the Peacemakers and Bob's contribution to this area through the alternative of a collaborative practice. And but here too, what strikes me is Bob's merciful realism. He knows that lawyers and clients who negotiate are prone to posturing and gamesmanship, including highly inflated and low-ball opening proposals. The collaborative practice approach is specifically designed to anticipate and address those concerns. This form of peacemaking also facilitates communication and collaboration across disciplines, enabling lawyers to join with mental health and financial professionals, as we've heard from the description of the work at the Union Rescue, the clinical work there, to work as a team in order to coordinate the service that clients often need, especially in family law matters. Blessed are you, Bob. How many families, how many children have been spared exposure to ongoing conflict because your work on the guidelines for collaborative practice have helped to fortify a more peaceful and cooperative approach to resolving important disputes. Thanks to your peacemaking work, our profession has taken steps ahead to recognize, even if just a little bit more, how we can treat each other as children of God together. Rejoice and be glad, Bob. Great is the reward of a life spent in the effort to do good and be good, sharing with a generous heart, mind, and soul the enormous gifts that God's love has entrusted to your stewardship. Thank you for all of the ways in which you have helped us to experience the kingdom of God in legal education and professional life.
It's hard to go after that, especially when I'm the only one standing between you and lunch. But I'm delighted to be here, honored to be here for this event that you richly deserve. And happy to make a few remarks. I am, I think along with Professor Elzinga, the only non-law professor of those speaking here today. I guess it's the Dutch guys that have to come in. You know. There's some people who can talk about Dutch people, some people will just live it. I guess we're holding down the non-law professor part of it. I can't say that this room is bereft of people who are theologians. That it's a remarkable number of people who have theological degrees of one sort or another. But I am a professor of theology and ethics, and so I thought I'd give some reflections from that perspective. I think that's perhaps the only unique thing I really bring to this. There's obviously a lot of pressure in the academic world generally to specialize, and there's been, of course, this increasing specialization in so many fields. And yet, I think this is kind of safe to say in a crowd like this, but I think there still are many of us who recognize that there are just a whole lot of important issues that just can't be reduced to one discipline or another. And if we're thinking about issues like justice or religious liberty or human rights, kind of things that people here work on, I think we recognize that these are just, if you just look at these from one academic specialty, from that perspective, it's going to be a very limited and distorted perspective. And I think one of the things that I appreciate so much about Bob is his promotion of a multidisciplinary outlook, and it's not just encouraging collaboration. We've heard a lot about that, and that sort of, kind of it's like 15 minutes could save you 15% or less. And this kind of obvious that everyone appreciates about Bob is the promotion of collaboration. But I especially appreciate his efforts to bring people from many different academic disciplines together, even as he works in a law school context. In my own journey, I studied at a seminary, then I went on to get a law degree. Then I went on and got a PhD in theological ethics at a Roman Catholic university, where I wrote my dissertation on Thomas Aquinas. Then went to teach at a confessional Reformed seminary, and just my own training and my own interests were. I wasn't very content to remain within the bounds of one really tightly bounded discipline. And a lot of the issues that I really wanted to work on, such as natural law, were really inherently multidisciplinary. And yet it's not at all obvious how someone in my position, teaching at a small Reformed seminary, how I would actually be able to get a lot of opportunities to interact with people in the legal academy and other places. And I'm very grateful that the Lord put some excellent people and some excellent opportunities in my life that opened up some of these doors. And one of the very most important has been Bob Cochran, and I really, really appreciate that. I was thinking back to what I'm almost certain is the first time, not where we met, but that we talked. I was sitting in my office, and I just got a call out of the blue from a Pepperdine law professor named Bob Cochran. And I was talking with Barb last night, and this came up in conversation. And she said, "He just called you out of the blue?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "That sounds so much like Bob." So Bob just called me out of the blue. I think he had read something I wrote and asked me to give a lecture for a course. I don't know exactly what the course was. I forget what the course was, but asked me to give a lecture on John Calvin's view of the law. So in a way, this is a good illustration of Bob's multidisciplinary interest. I mean, for one thing, Bob is teaching a course in which John Calvin's view of the law could be relevant. That's not very common in the legal academy. And he invites a seminary professor to come and to give a lecture for him. And I think that probably the next major interaction I had with Bob was when he again sort of contacted me and maybe not quite out of the blue as the first time was, but proposed the idea that turned into the volume Law in the Bible. And at that time, I had just recently finished a big book editing project that was a lot of work and involved a few headaches along the way. And like the last thing I was looking for was another book editing project. And that was the first thought when Bob proposed this. I thought, not another book editing project. But Bob is a hard person to say no to, but it wasn't just that. I stepped back and I thought, well, you know what? I mean, what Bob was thinking about, it was not just an opportunity for me to work with Bob, but he was proposing an idea in which not just law professors and theologians would just contribute their own chapters to a book and collect those essays together, but actually make the law professors and the theologians co-author these chapters of the book. And so that's a really interesting way to promote multidisciplinary work, is to actually make the people write together. So that was another great example of Bob's promotion of multidisciplinary work. There are other examples in the volume Agape, Justice, and Law, which has come out just the last year or two. Again, another project in which Bob and Zach didn't make people actually co-author things, but they did collect essays from people from a lot of different disciplines. And of course, the annual NUPAR conferences are, I guess they're primarily law professor and lawyer focused, but I felt so welcomed as part of those conferences. And there have been others from various fields who have also been welcomed and have joined the conversation as very important and valued contributors. Well, when it comes to, in thinking about this multidisciplinary part of Bob's work, one of the interests that Bob has is the place of law in Scripture, and that is an inherently multidisciplinary question as well. And Bob has obviously written some pieces in trying to think about law in Scripture, and especially Jesus' teaching about law in the Gospels. His piece in Law in the Bible and his piece in Agape, Justice, and Law are very much about that subject. Now, before I knew anything about this event, I was planning to write an essay on Matthew 5, 17 through 48, which, if you don't know, is part of the Sermon on the Mount, which this is not very original by this point in the morning's proceedings. But I was interested in writing something on this text, not just for its own sake, but as a kind of foundation for larger projects that I had in mind. And as I hadn't begun working on this, but as I had intended to do that soon, I got an email from Derek asking me to participate in this. And I think it took me maybe 90 seconds to know what I wanted to do for this. I guess this essay I was going to write is going to be in the Pepperdine Law Journal Law Review. I hadn't planned on that, but it seemed clear to me that this would be a great way for me to try to honor Bob and to try to write the best essay I could on this very important text. This comes almost immediately after the Beatitudes. There's a brief text on being salt and light, and then immediately after that, Matthew 5:17, Jesus says, "I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And so I look at this text and the rest of this chapter. It's interesting in listening to David Skeel's his description of his essay earlier. I didn't know he was going to be working on this, and I don't really think my views fit into any of your three categories exactly, but that probably doesn't surprise you that there are obviously going to be a lot of nuances. I think just to say a few things really briefly. I'm not going to tell you how I unpack my kind of detailed look at this text that will be in the printed version. The way I see it in the big picture, the Sermon on the Mount is about the kingdom. It's about the kingdom of heaven. But it's about the kingdom of heaven well, let me say this. The kingdom of heaven in the Gospel of Matthew is ultimately an eschatological idea. It's the new creation. That's ultimately what the kingdom is. But I think the Sermon on the Mount is about how that eschatological kingdom is to be actually in some way realized here and now. And particularly in this movement from the old to the new, from the old covenant to the new covenant, as Jesus comes and exercises his ministry. And I do think that in the Gospel of Matthew, particularly we see it in Matthew 16, where Jesus gives the keys of the kingdom of heaven to his church, that it is particularly the church that is to manifest this kingdom of heaven here and now. So I guess that would tend to put me in one of David's groups, although I would also say that doesn't mean you have to be a lover of Donald Trump to say that, which complicates everything, of course. Let me just say two things. With respect to the question, which is, it's a huge question for the gospel, not just for Matthew 5, not just for the Sermon on the Mount, but for the whole Gospel of Matthew, and even for the New Testament as a whole. What does it mean that Jesus came to fulfill the law? I mean, that is really, it's an enormously huge and controversial question. My own way of trying to explain this is with an analogy that I've used in a previous writing, although I'm trying to develop this a little bit more here, that you sort of want to think about this as light going through a prism. That I'm not a physicist and I can't explain how this works from that perspective, but it's the same light that goes into a prism that comes out on the other side. And yet the light looks more beautiful on the other side. And I think that's what the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospel of Matthew is getting at, is that when Jesus comes to fulfill the law, it's the same law of God, but the law of God looks more beautiful on the other side of Jesus coming. And I think the sermon and the Gospel of Matthew is trying to work that out. But I think Bob will be happy, maybe David Skill will be happy too, that at the end of my essay, I actually I give a couple of implications for contemporary law. So I think there are implications of this for law. One of them, the first that I discuss at the end of my essay, is, and I think this is especially what Matthew 5:38 through 42 is getting at, when Jesus says, "You've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I say, turn the other cheek." That on the other side of Jesus coming, the church, as the covenant people, no longer have civil jurisdiction. That under the old covenant, the covenant people of Israel had civil jurisdiction. They had the power of the sword. They had courts in which they were to enforce the claims of justice. But as Jesus gives to his church, he builds his church and gives it the keys of the kingdom of heaven, he does not give it the sword. He does not give it civil jurisdiction. There still is civil jurisdiction in the world, but it doesn't belong to the church of Jesus Christ. And that may seem obvious to us, but it was not obvious to the original hearers of the Sermon on the Mount. And I believe the fact that it is not the new covenant community that bears the sword, I think that has a lot of implications for the way that we think about civil justice in this world. A second implication for contemporary law that I suggest, and this has particular bearing to the very end of Matthew 5, in which Jesus says, "You've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you." There's a movement that we see in the Gospel of Matthew as well as in the larger New Testament. God's people are no longer going to be living in a wholly geographically bounded land. Under the Old Covenant, Israel lived in a land, in a holy land, and they were to protect the holiness of that land. And there was nothing like religious liberty in what we know as ancient Israel. There are other ways to put it, but I think that's one way to put it. There was not a robust religious liberty. There was the death penalty for idolatry. But there's a movement in that, and you see this at the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, which ends with the Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples. The Church of Jesus Christ is not it doesn't have a holy land. It is to be scattered throughout this world. And I think this is it's corresponding to that is Jesus' command to say, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and be sons of your Father who is in heaven, who gives rain and sun indiscriminately. We are not called to, as the people of God, to be seeking the death penalty for idolatry. We are to live peacefully with those who are of other faiths, with neighbors of many kinds. And I think there is an implicit argument here for a robust support of religious liberty on the part of Christians. And of course, that has not been the position of so many Christians through history. But I do think that it finds some of its support in the Sermon on the Mount, particularly at the end of Matthew 5. Well, I will end there. I am going to close with what I have drafted as the final 2 sentences of my essay. I am profoundly grateful for the many contributions Bob Cochran has made to Christian legal scholarship, and perhaps especially for the ways he has promoted serious biblical reflection on the law. I offer this article with thanks as an effort to continue the conversations that Bob has so wonderfully kindled. Thank you.
So thanks so much to our presenters. Given that we got a little bit of a late start for this panel, I think we're going to go a little bit beyond the scheduled end. The scheduled end was 12:15, but we can go a little bit beyond that, I think. Let's open things up to questions, comments amongst the panelists, amongst everybody.
I just wanted to add something to David's talk about Kuyper and neo-Calvinism, which was an idea I had not encountered until he contributed to the book that Angela and Bob and I did some time ago. But just from a slightly different perspective, I think this is one of the most important things to emphasize in our particular political, social, cultural circumstances today. One of the things that at least I find so distressing is the politicization of everything. And so, the idea of sphere sovereignty is such a helpful way of explaining why it is that you don't have to decide what pizza you buy on the basis of politics. It's okay, right? And I really, I just wish more people would, think fruitfully about the idea that, not just that Christian faith should not be, the church should not be dominant in the pizza selling business, but no other faith should be either. And we can live together in a pluralistic country just so much more fruitfully if we respect these different spheres.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've always looked at that and thought it's terribly important, really useful way to describe a whole lot of issues. It's interesting, the list always is the state. The state is sovereign. And then Kuyper immediately puts it in a particular, over certain things. Certainly not sovereign over the family, certainly not sovereign over the church. The church is the obvious one. And not over business. He always throws that in, like deregulation or something. I always look at that, but what he means is, they don't need to be involved in every decision we make of what we're going to sell and buy to each other. And that I think that is a useful concept.
I'm just going to say, I think it is interesting in Kuiper's idea of sphere of sovereignty that these other spheres, they're not created by the guy. There's no central authority that's creating these. The idea that there's sort of an organic, these are rising up organically from human life and from who we are as image bearers of God. And I think that, I think that has, there are obviously different ways to try to describe that, but it seems to me that it's a really important thing and contributes to, I think, what Professor Cochran is saying.
Where does this take us in terms of ultimately perhaps civil disobedience of Christians when the state exceeds its sphere? Obviously we had that in the civil rights movement. As the culture changes, are we going to see that?
I wouldn't think it would be civil disobedience. I would think it would be simply challenging the legal claims of the government that it has authority over the particular question at hand. And then hopefully the courts will show sphere of sovereignty with respecting the independent choices that people can make.
I actually had the same reaction, and I thought, well, but long before civil disobedience, there's debate, there's writing, there's arguing, there's lobbying, there's organizing before you have to get to that point.
So this is a question for one of the two Davids who've been thinking hard about Kuiper. This is an aside. I'm currently reading Kuiper's book on Islam. It's a hefty thing to read, but I'm struck at how prescient it is in terms of at least informing my thinking about how I think about Islam, something that he wrote decades and decades ago. But I'm wondering, in the idea of sphere sovereignty, what would you think Kuiper, how would Kuiper look at a lot of the stuff that comes out of law schools, but somewhat influenced by behavioral economists like Thaler, people like Sunstein, the idea of a nudge. Does a nudge, can you have sphere sovereignty and have the state nudging people, or would Kuiper look at the nudge idea and saying that really is a form of political heresy and stands outside the boundaries of how you view the state?
Well, I mean, when you think about it, here we are saying sphere sovereignty, the state doesn't have all the power. I mean, Calvin and Cochran and Kuiper are right in the state. They'd like to have the state. They'd like to be in that position. I mean, they're running for prime minister. They want to run things. So their attitude, I mean, in the pluralistic attitude is, as Christians, it would be kind of nice if we had control of everything. Not because we're theocracy, not because we can force anything on anybody, but, Kuiper said, I got some better ideas about how to do this. So I mean, the nudge, maybe that's a good thing. And he's not against government, and neither was Calvin. I mean, they say that's the difference, that Luther is a monk, he's an Augustinian monk, and Calvin is not, and he's going to law school. So immediately, he doesn't have any negative views about the state. He's like, I want to get in there, and I want to do it. So I think nudging may be fine. That may be a nice, I've never thought of Christianizing the nudge concept. But now, now that I think about it, it's not a bad idea to say maybe the state can encourage people to go in one direction rather than another.
I mean, the one way to think about the nudge is the idea that the government should not have a thumb on the scale among the free choices that people make, right? And so in business, the government should not have a thumb on the scale favoring domestic competitors versus foreign competitors, or small owners versus big owners. In school choice, the government shouldn't have a thumb on the scale favoring public education versus private school choice education. You should give equal opportunity for people's freedom of choice, is one way to think about the idea of a nudge.
I'm okay with government nudging as long as I or someone who thinks like me is the one who's.
It's a very Calvinistic.
I think I would take maybe a little bit more negative take from trying to put myself in Kuiper's eyes, maybe than what David just said. I think, you're certainly right. I mean, Kuiper wasn't like the night watchman state. I mean, he thought government did have, some robust roles. But it does strike me that would strike Kuiper as paternalistic in certain ways that I think he would be uncomfortable with, in that, he did, a lot of things that he wrote about the government, it really just portrayed as more like a referee than one who was actually trying to get the game going in a certain direction. But I think one thing that would be also important to say is that it wouldn't be in terms of trying to put a thumb on the scale of individuals' choices so much as trying to be a referee among these different spheres. So it wouldn't just be a collection of individuals. It would be actually other institutions and communities that have this integrity that government needs to protect. So I think it's kind of a complicated question, or a complicated answer to maybe a simple question, actually.
But it goes back to Mike McConnell's statement. Cochran gets involved because the state considers the state to be the normal education, and they should run the schools. I mean, that's the issue that brings him to the fore. And that, well, you know, religious schools, I mean, that's bringing in a bunch of religious stuff. We're just the normal school. We're just the one that's teaching the normal things. And the Calvinists get like, I don't want my kids to be learning that there is no God and that God doesn't have anything to do with anything. You know, I think we need our own schools. And he makes a big deal about that, which of course the Roman Catholics had that idea long before the Calvinists. But anyway, he starts saying there needs to be Christian schools. And when he says Christian schools, he does not mean Catholic schools. He means Protestant schools. And that's the whole thing that gets them going. So
Yeah, but he also thought Catholics should have their own schools. And,
absolutely.
You know, so it was,
yeah. And, you know, well, I mean, it's consociational democracy, that's in Holland. We think that the state as a religion ought to have their own schools. And we think the Catholics as a religion ought to have their own schools. Maybe even Islamic people should have their own schools. Because they're all religions.
I have a question. I was really struck by I heard of common grace, but it just struck me for this time that we're living now. And it seems to me that the piece you're writing now is again in conversation with David Skeel's analysis of, you know, what's happening now in our political terrain in terms of the capacity to recognize the good in each other, and again, not to over-politicize pizza and chicken and all kinds of other things. And so, I mean, I just was curious about the power of this concept of common grace for talking about the political and social fabric now. It's just a very large question, but it seems to me it's a really, really rich terrain to think about pluralism, deep pluralism in terms that hang together within Pepper's.
Yeah, what is Dante doesn't put the philosophers in a bad part of hell. You know, they're pretty smart people. I mean, they should be in the first circle of hell. It's just kind of like a park. It's kind of like a mansion, you know, and you just kind of be there. You're not going to get to heaven. But, you know, everything you said was right. Everything you said was good. You were not bad people, you know. You just weren't Christian. You didn't know Christ. But you're good people. So you should be in a nice part of hell. You know, it's just, everything's good. Beyond that, it starts getting bad. But you guys, it's basically the beach house, you know, in Malibu. I mean, it's just sit around and talk, you know, and I think that respect for, you know, it's not that everything that doesn't come out of the church, everything that doesn't come out of the Christian community is bad. Good ideas are out there, good people are out there, people doing good things, and that's, I mean, Kuiper saying that, people serving each other, people, lots of good things. So I think that's the point, is everybody can know right from wrong, and that's why Bob says that gives you an opening maybe for all of us to work together for something. Kuiper said that. He said, I see a potential for peace and justice because there's some things we all agree on. But that doesn't mean that I have to agree with what every politician's saying, because I'm going, that guy, common grace didn't work for him. He doesn't know right from wrong. You know? And so that's a different argument.
Would you join me in thanking our speakers?